Well, hello, it's Mr. Ippolito, and now we are going to go over slavery in the U.S. Constitution and effects on the nation. So let's just go ahead and jump right in so I can help you out with this. All right, so the first question is, should enslaved people be counted as part of the population? Now, all of these questions are actually answered right here in the document. So really all you need to use as a resource is this reading right here, but you just need to know where to find it, right? So I'm going to help you out. Should enslaved people be counted as part of the population? This is the first question that the Constitution is going to answer regarding slavery. So what is the compromise here? So let's look in the reading here. This right here, this is like the context, right? So this is the context. So in this case, the answer isn't necessarily in here. It's just kind of explaining what was going into this decision, right? And so the answer is actually going to come right here. So talking about, which is something we've learned before, you should make sure to read it if you haven't already. States with larger populations have more representation in Congress, in the House of Representatives. Southern slaves wanted the slaves to be counted, even though their slaves were not considered citizens. The North objected. Obviously, the North objected because the more that the South can claim people, then the more representation they have in Congress. And the North, they wanted to have, the northern states wanted to have more power. And so the South is like, well, we should count our slaves as 100% people. The North is like, well, you don't treat them like 100% people, so you shouldn't count them for the purposes of getting congressional representation like 100% people. You should count them as 0% people. And so they compromised, and the compromise they came up with is the 3/5 compromise. So up here, what was the constitutional compromise? It was the 3/5 compromise, right? And then it's just asking, include the article and section. So again, looking at the reading, that article and section is Article 1, Section 2. So I'll just go back here, and I will just say Article 1, Section 2. There we go. And then what effect did this have on the nation? Well, let's go back to the reading. Let's see if we can find out. This decision increased the South's representation and power in Congress and the Electoral College. As a result, in 12 of the first 16 presidential elections, a Southern slave owner won. That's kind of crazy to think about, right? The 3/5 compromise was ultimately repealed by the 14th Amendment in 1868. So, going back here, and I'll even kind of zoom in here a little bit. South has greater representation. You can abbreviate in Congress. Let's go back to the reading again. What else? 12 of the first 16 presidents in 12 of the first 16 elections, a Southern slave owner won. So 12 of the first 16 elections, a Southern slave owner won the presidency, right? It's important that we note that it's the presidency. And then maybe talk about not only the political impact, but maybe talk about the human impact as well, right? So, and this is an idea that we got from the video, the Crash Course video, the Crash Course Black American History video, right? Where essentially the enslaved were treated like 3/5 of a human. Should probably make this a little bit of a finer point. Okay. And that is part 1 right there. So now if we move on to part 2, what should be done about the slave trade? Well, again, if we read this section right here, what should be done about the slave trade? This is context. So that's telling you the story. You should read the story. Some Southern delegates wanted the slave trade to continue. In other words, they wanted to be able to continue bringing new slaves into the United States. It's important to note, this is the international slave trade. International. International means that enslaved people were being captured in Africa, kidnapped in Africa, and brought over to the United States, or from the Caribbean and brought over to the United States. Again, this is from other parts of the world. After the international slave trade was abolished, the interstate slave trade, right? In other words, trading slaves in between communities and in between states, that still continued. But the international slave trade is what we're talking about right now. Eventually, the framers of the Constitution decided to put off, they basically like kicked the can down the road, right? Decided to put off making a decision about the slave trade. Okay, so, let's go back. How long? They put it off until 1808. So, what should be done? Postponed or put off. That's another way of saying put off. Postponed or delayed. That's another good way to say it. Delayed a decision on the slave trade for 20 years. That's 20 years after the Constitution would have been ratified, right? Ultimately, the Constitution was ratified in 1788. It was written in 1787, finally ratified in 1788. And so 1788 plus 20 years, that's 1808, is when finally Congress could act to limit or to ban the international slave trade, which they ultimately did in 1808. And then where can we find that? What's the article and section? That is Article 1, Section 9, right? So Article 1, Section 9. I'll write this here. Article 1, Section 9. And then finally the consequences. So let's go back to the consequences. Extending the slave trade into the 1800s brought many more slaves to the United States. So now we're talking about the consequences here, or the, what does it say? Oh, effects on the nation. So that's the question that we're answering right here, effects on the nation. So what effect did this have on the nation? Extending the slave trade into the 1800s brought many more slaves to the United States. For instance, South Carolina alone imported 40,000 enslaved people between 1803 and 1808. Because they knew that once 1808 happened, it could be turned off, which it was. Congress overwhelmingly voted to end the slave trade in 1808. This stopped the practice of bringing new slaves to the United States, but did not free slaves already living in the country. And for those people who thought, you know what, maybe this will slowly bring about the end of the practice of slavery. But because the health conditions, I'm not saying they were great, but because the health conditions for enslaved people in the American South were better than in the Caribbean, right? Because in the Caribbean and in South America, there were actually far more enslaved people there than in the United States. But because the conditions were better, the health conditions, not great, but better, there was, through the natural process of giving birth, even though they were no longer importing enslaved people into the United States, there was still a great natural increase, right? Just through pregnancy, a great natural increase in enslaved people, because they were the people who owned enslaved people, right? The white owners of enslaved people, they were encouraging slave men and slave women to come together to have to make babies. And as we've already discussed previously, these white slave owners were also getting their enslaved women pregnant in order to also to increase that population. So it turns out they didn't even need the international slave trade in order to vastly increase the population of enslaved people in the United States. Ultimately, slavery was not outlawed until the 13th Amendment was passed in 1865. So I am not, we've talked about it, but I'm not going to not going to fill in those answers for you. I've shown you where to find those answers, right? Okay, and then finally, do states have a responsibility to return? Do states have a responsibility to return escaped slaves? So now let's look at this. A little bit of background here. Enslaved people resisted their treatment in many ways, including escaping to the north. Those who ran away were called fugitive slaves. Some Southern delegates thought that slaves should help catch and return fugitive slaves. Others felt that a fugitive slave clause would infringe on states' rights. The Southern states won out. So, in this case, was it even a compromise? It wasn't even a compromise, right? It was just the South won. The South got what they wanted. Article 4, Section 2 of the Constitution contains a fugitive slave clause that says escaped slaves must be returned to their enslavers. So if you run away, if you somehow gain your freedom as an enslaved person, you think about it, you've been kidnapped and held captive your entire life with no freedom, and you finally escape to freedom, and the Constitution says that you're going to be hunted down. You're going to be hunted down and returned. This clause was enforced by laws passed in 1793 and 1850, which allowed escaped slaves to be chased into the north and caught. Many people made a living as fugitive slave catchers. They not only captured runaway slaves, but also illegally kidnapped thousands of free blacks and returned them to slavery. The Fugitive Slave Clause was repealed by the 13th Amendment, which prohibited slavery. So, again, in this part here, what was the compromise? We talked about it. There was no compromise. The South won, right? And what part of the Constitution? I believe, we'll just go back and look, but I believe it was Article 4, Section 2. So there you go right there. You can write that down. And then in this part here, this is where it talks about the effects, right? Which is going to what you will put then in that other box. I'm not going to write it down for you. I believe that you can do that based on this information here. Finally, I think it's important to note this right here. The words slave or slavery are never mentioned in the Constitution. However, the decisions made by the framers allowed slavery to exist in the United States. This affected the lives of millions of enslaved people as well as their descendants. So, that is how to complete the assignment, Slavery in the U.S. Constitution and Effects on the Nation. There you go. I hope that helped. Thanks so much, and have a great day. Bye-bye.